So, here it is, Final Fantasy 13. This game is without a doubt the most divisive of the series. To some, this is their favourite in the series, while others loathe its existence. This game was launched on the PS3 and Xbox 360 in 2009 in Japan and early 2010 worldwide. Directed by Motomu Toriyama, who worked on Final Fantasy VII as an event planner, Final Fantasy X as a co-director and writer, and, yes, directed Final Fantasy X too. He was also involved with other spin-off games like Dissidia and Crystal Chronicles on the Wii eShop. The games he had major creative control on definitely show his design philosophy, that being linear design with character-focused story. It was pitched as the flagship title for both a new game engine and for a collection of Final Fantasy games called the Fabula Nova Crystallis. Basically games that shared the same mythos and were to explore the various aspects of that. The three games initially announced were 13, Agito 13, and Versus 13. 13 itself and its direct sequels were the only ones to really take advantage of that. Agito 13 turned into Type 0, which retained the terminology and mythology, but applied it to different concepts and used them in different ways. Versus 13 turned into 15 after being stuck in development limbo for 7 years, and was basically stripped of anything related to 13. So yeah, all that to basically say, the team behind Final Fantasy 13 had big ambitions, even if they ultimately didn't pan out quite the way they expected. I sure hope that isn't foreshadowing. For this playthrough, I played the Steam version of the game on PC. Here's the thing with the PC version though, it's broken. It runs without crashing, and they patched in actual real resolutions after people complained how it only allowed 720p initially. However, the game runs extremely poorly, the frame rate dropping significantly in battles. Luckily, the fix is really easy. All you need is this simple mod that I'll leave a link for in the description. Drag and drop the files into the right folder, and hey presto, it's now running buttery smooth. The fix mostly does this by removing the frame pacer and disabling the game from scanning for a controller every second. It's weird. But Square have a reputation at this point for not fixing their broken PC ports themselves. I'm looking at you, Nier Automata. Outside of this issue, the game is basically the same no matter where you play it, other than higher frame rate during gameplay on PC. It's even backwards compatible on Xbox consoles now, with improved resolutions on the One X and Series consoles. A new console generation means new shiny graphics. This is one aspect of Final Fantasy XIII that doesn't disappoint. I'm not always 100% sold on the actual design part of the graphics, but from a technical aspect this game is drop dead gorgeous. Even today in 2021, it still looks quite impressive. I feel the video will speak for me on this front, especially in battles. One of my favourite little flourishes is in the menus, when choosing equipment for each character. They play a small FMV clip before settling on a freeze frame. It's extremely stylish and it's something I appreciate. Cool menus make navigating them just a little bit more interesting. It's certainly part of why going in the menu is so fun in something like Persona 5. For all my praise of the graphics in general though, I do take some issues with it, specifically in the art style itself. It's perfectly fine for the most part, however I do feel that in places it's a bit over-designed. So a couple of examples of what I mean. The first example for me is at the start of the game, the hanging edge. As mentioned before, from a technical aspect I think this is really impressive looking. However, it looks far too busy. I can't tell what I'm looking at most of the time, and I can't ground myself to figure out whereabout in the world we are. Obviously it takes place on a series of highways and bridges, but it all looks so alien otherwise it's hard to get a sense of place. My other example is an FMV from later in the game, where the group is using their summons to fight soldiers. Again, it looks great technically, but the designs of the summons they use is overly detailed, and so the action gets lost in a sea of effects and movement. This makes the action hard to follow, and makes my eyes glaze over a little as it's happening, to be honest. Or maybe I'm getting old, I don't know. But I think this is a similar issue that something like the Transformers films ran into, where the characters were so overly detailed that when action happened, it was really hard to follow. Obviously, this is only an issue with the action in this specific scene with the summons deployed, but it does highlight my issue with the aesthetics of the summons being over-designed. The aim with the battle system of Final Fantasy XIII was to try to create gameplay that looked as fast and fluid as the fights in Advent Children. An ambitious goal to be sure. While I think this aim is incredibly misguided, as I feel that gameplay should feel good before looking good, they did make battles extremely flashy. Aside from aesthetics, I think the battle system itself is actually rather engaging. Once you unlock the freedom to actually make use of it, of course. I understand the want to introduce players to this new combat system slowly, and part of the combat system is unlocked as part of the story to be fair, but this both happens rather early in the game, and the features locked make little sense. In other games in the series, the major aspects of the battle system aren't just locked off, they're limited by your available resources. You're not locked off from using the materia system in Final Fantasy VII for several hours of the game, you just have less options available to you. This lets you experiment with your limited verbs within the system, then allows you to master it on your own. In Final Fantasy XIII, you could barely experiment with what makes the battles interesting until many hours into the game. To stick with the Final Fantasy VII comparison, this would be like only being able to use the attack command up to Wall Market, and after that only being able to use pre-equipped materia on each character up until leaving Midgar, and only then can you adjust materia on party members, plus a few extra hours. Again, I do understand to a point why they did it this way. I could even excuse not having much to play with up until that point I mentioned early in the story, but please, respect the intelligence of your audience. Anyway, let's talk about the actual mechanics of the battles. The ATB bar is back, but acts a little different this time. One full bar is filled up with several actions in a row, starting with 2 but increases to 5 or 6 in the late game. You can fill these in yourself, or you can make use of the auto battle. Generally speaking, auto battle does the job well enough. It's smart enough to know when an enemy is weak to a certain element or attack type. There are cases of choosing abilities yourself though. I found it especially useful for queuing up AoE heals, for example. The big difference between this and previous games is that you only control the party leader directly, while the other 2 party members are controlled by the AI. It makes some sense as battles are a bit busier now with the fast pace you'd need to be putting in commands, but the AI aren't always the smartest, and are clearly just spamming auto battle as part of their AI routine. This definitely made me want some form of gambit system again in some situations, like making buffers prioritise certain buffs or in a specific order. There are no traditional classes in Final Fantasy XIII, but there are 6 roles for each character to use in battle. Those are Commando, Ravager, Sentinel, Saboteur, Synergist, and Medic. Each character specialises in 3 of these initially, but can access the other 3 after a certain point in the story, and only after investing enough points in the extra role to learn a skill in it. How the battles work is that you switch between different sets of roles as you battle to adapt to the situation at hand, a mechanic known as paradigm shift. The goal of every fight is obviously most importantly to defeat the enemies, but secondarily to build up the stagger meter of the enemies to enable you to do much more damage. This is done by chaining magic together to rapidly build up the stagger meter, which is what the Ravager role's primary purpose is. This is complemented by commandos who use physical attacks to slow down the degradation of the chain and can launch staggered enemies. Which, by the way, is an incredibly satisfying finishing move. Sentinels use provoke and tank damage, medics are obviously the healer archetype, and synergists and saboteurs buff your party and debuff the enemy. Those last 2 are very important, by the way. They help make fights go by a lot quicker. In fact, this is the most useful buffs and debuffs have been in a Final Fantasy game for a long time for the mandatory story content. I'm hard pushed to think of a JRPG with this much emphasis on status effects this side of Shin Megami Tensei. You can store up to 6 paradigms to make use of in battle using any combination of the roles available to the party. They all have their names too, which I think is a nice little touch. By the end of the game, and for some of the late game bosses, my preferred opening paradigm was Commando, Synergist and Saboteur to start off with a little initial damage and getting all the status effects applied as quick as possible. Then I'd switch to Ravager Commando to get the chain and damage going once enough effects were applied. I made use of a double Medic and Sentinel paradigm for quick healing too, should the need arise. This approach saw me get through most of the late game fights rather quickly, and was really satisfying to pull off. It's a combat system which has a surprising amount of depth to it with all sorts of tricks you can pull off. That's definitely not to say it's flawless though, far from it. One of my issues is with the encounter design, which kind of bleeds into the level design. Your party fully heals after every battle in the game, which is nice until you realise they balance this by making a lot of the standard encounters quite tough or involved. There were times in the game where I'd be in fights several minutes at a time and barely making any progress in a dungeon or wherever I was, sometimes pushing 5 minutes for a single battle. And those longer battles awarded me 5 stars at the end too, which meant I beat them well within the recommended time. My other issue I had with the battles, especially as I got further into the game, is the lack of response the characters have at times. Be that having to play out a long animation on the first paradigm shift of the battle, leaving you essentially prone for a couple of seconds, and definitely contributed to some early battle deaths. Or that sometimes, especially when it comes to healing, the animations don't play out quickly due to having to turn to face their target. Like, just have it so that healing spells don't have to be aimed by the character. It led to so many deaths or close calls. Or that if the party leader dies, then it's game over. The game doesn't care if you have anyone else alive or you have a ton of Phoenix Downs to use. I think that can be really frustrating, especially when you just get unlucky and the party leader is the target of all the enemies, stun locking them to death. The paradigm shift issue I had is addressed in 13.2 for what it's worth. I just wish they made it that snappy to begin with though. And that's the crux of my issues with the battle system, I think. Despite liking a lot of it, I can't call it a favoured battle system of mine, nowhere close. My favourite battle systems in the series so far have been really responsive, such as the instant action of Final Fantasy VII. It's really snappy, which was lost a little in 8 and 9. Or in 10, where, once again, characters act the second you confirm an action. Even Final Fantasy XII, if you manually chose an action for a character, they would instantly start making it happen. This is why I started off talking about the combat as being steered in a direction I felt was misguided, because as cool as the animations are, and as satisfying as the paradigm system is, the focus on making the game look good above all else hurts the game feel. The good ideas are hindered by clunky execution or what feels like a lack of responsiveness. Outside of battle, the gameplay is kind of boring to be honest. The Crystarium, the level up mechanic, is rather linear. Again, it sort of feels like they aim to make it look good rather than make it interesting. There's little choice with how you develop the characters, despite what your first impression may be. The extra roles you unlock later in the game cost a lot more points to level up than their initial 3 for example, and then leveling up the trees is devoid of interesting decisions other than which of these roles should I level first. The path of the Crystarium is fittingly much like the paths you take through the world outside of battle. Final Fantasy XIII is extremely linear. That concept isn't new though. Technically pretty much every Final Fantasy game is linear due to there only being one correct way to advance the story. In the older games, progression was gated behind block passages or impassable terrain until you get the right vehicle. The closest relative this game has though is Final Fantasy X. That game is also criticised for its overly linear paths through the game world, especially something like the Mi'ihen High Road. However, the major difference between the two is the pacing. In Final Fantasy XIII, you're encouraged to blitz through the environments as quickly as possible, following the only trail available to you, with very slight detours to pick up additional loot. This was sort of the case in Final Fantasy X too, however one key difference is the presence of NPCs you could talk to, and towns you could spend downtime in. Talking to the historian in 10, as well as other NPCs, gave the environment some character and revealed aspects of the world to you. The towns also permitted time to let the story breathe, and also gave the player a break from simply moving forward and moving forward and fighting, something that Final Fantasy XIII runs into a lot. The excuse is that the characters are on the run for the majority of the story, but this doesn't help alleviate that tedium of doing nothing but walking forwards and getting into fights with nothing to break that up aside from small cutscenes. What especially doesn't help is when a lot of the levels are basically set in gigantic rooms with floating platforms. They're very impressive big rooms, but the fact it can take over half an hour to get through some of them due to the length and amount of battles makes them a little boring eventually. Even the final dungeon does this. It's a really impressive looking place, but you're literally just walking on floating walkways for the majority of it. And that's not to say anything about some of the egregious copy-paste design of some of the mid-game dungeons. I've heard it said that the point where the game opens up and you are more free to explore in a wide world is when it gets better. Dear viewer, let me tell you that that is a lie. The open world is a featureless huge step with very narrow corridor areas splintering off from it. The only content to do outside of the main quest is boring hunts delivered by statues. These especially falter when comparing them to the hunts of Final Fantasy XII. In 12, the hunts were given by actual characters within the world and had a story to go with them, with a fair amount of the marks only appearing under special circumstances. Plus it has its own little side story that has you digging deeper into the lore of Ivalice. There were even unique monsters to fight in the hunts that you'd never see anywhere else. What do we have here in 13? Nothing but fighting reskinned enemies for unimportant rewards with very weak rationale. You're finishing off the task left by Old Seath, people who failed their focus and turned into monsters, or I guess statues in this case. The thing is, this framing doesn't really make sense for like 99% of the marks. So if they're Old Seath and Pulse, and there seems to be literally no other humans left on Pulse to help finish off these tasks, then how long exactly have these stones been here with their tasks left unfinished? If it's been tens of years or maybe even centuries, then how could the monsters they failed to kill possibly still be about, let alone still be in the same place? Context matters for stuff like this, and I think Final Fantasy XIII fails in this regard. Plus the hunts are literally the only side content. In 12 for example, there was tons of stuff I never got close to scratching the surface of. All the hunts, all the optional summons, a fishing minigame I somehow missed, and other various little side missions for NPCs. Let's move on from the gameplay and talk about the story. The basic premise is that our band of misfits get pulled into a shared fate when they all get chosen by an otherworldly god to enact their will, with the consequence of not doing so being turned into a monster. The game takes place in a world known as Cocoon, which is a world that hangs suspended over the land of Pulse. Both worlds are ruled over gods known as fal'Cie, who perform various functions to keep the world running, such as providing light or food or order. The fal'Cie of Cocoon are opposed to those from Pulse. They brand humans with the sigils and provide them with a focus or task, which is presented as a vision that's up for interpretation. Those given a focus by fal'Cie are known as l'Cie, and if they fail their task they wander the world as twisted monsters called Seath. These terms seem a bit complicated when you first encounter them, but to the game's credit, they're explained relatively well both through explanation and context. What I find a bit frustrating at the beginning of the game is that there's no groundwork attempted to establish your basic understanding of the world the game takes place in. Some things can be figured out by context. The Purge is obviously bad, l'Cie seemed to be disliked, and the Sanctum seemed to be the military presence. Everything else is kind of left up to the player to figure out or read about in a data log, which I'm in two minds about. It obviously allows for much deeper explanations of things that would otherwise bog down the pacing of the game, but when you're leaving stuff out of your opening, like establishing the setup for things to immediately come, I think something's wrong. I think the opening could have been slightly improved by just spending a minute or two providing a very basic setup for this setting. A lot of the previous games started with some action, but they always contextualized it beforehand. Final Fantasy VI had the equivalent to a Star Wars opening crawl, and it's awesome. Final Fantasy VII showed the entire city of Midgar before zooming into the action, which is explained as they went. Final Fantasy X sets up the character's place in the world before wrecking it completely. The difference with these games too is that their worlds seem more contemporary than Final Fantasy XIII's, which is decidedly more alien than any other setting in the series. For an example of how this is done well, simply look to Xenoblade Chronicles. This game came out a year after Final Fantasy XIII, but establishes the unique setting of the world extremely well, and still has an action-packed opening. It's really good. Play Xenoblade Chronicles if you haven't, please. To its credit, 13's story does get better as it goes on, although some things do continue to feel unexplained within the game itself. If there were still NPC characters to talk to throughout the game, like in 10, I think this issue could have been alleviated somewhat, but the story they wrote didn't allow for much of that, I suppose. The focus is on the main characters pretty much exclusively. The characters are definitely the highlight of the game. They're flawed people and they go through a lot of growth throughout the story. Some of them you may not even like at first. Snow, for example, seems rather obnoxious at first when he's parading himself around as a hero. He seems arrogant and obnoxious. Probably because he is a bit. I felt that I learned pretty quickly though that this is mostly a facade he puts on, as he thinks this is what makes a good leader. It's very clear that he has doubts about the way he presents himself early on, but continues to do so as that's all he knows how to do. He leads a group of rebels called Nora, and they're honestly the worst part of the opening. It's so incredibly cringy. Is this an anime trope? I don't watch enough to those, so be sure to let me know in the comments. Hope is another character I hear people don't like much, but again, he goes through a lot of growth throughout the game, and considering his age, he acts accordingly too. Very emotion driven, as a teenager would be. Seeing his mother die in the opening leaves an understandable impact on him, and blaming Snow for her death seems easy and kind of understandable from his perspective. Most of the characters I think are decent, to be honest. I like Lightning a lot. She starts off a bit cold, but again, she grows warmer as the story goes on. Pretty much every character grows in some form over the course of the story. Saz is my favourite character. He is the comic relief, but he's also given a pretty emotional story, one that I related to the most in all honesty. In terms of characters I'm not sure on, Vanille is really annoying to me. The voice acting is the worst part of her. The actor was directed to emulate the way the Japanese voice actor portrayed the character, which I'm really opposed to as a localization philosophy. It makes her overbearing and obnoxious, which is a shame as she's not a terrible character. The idea behind her isn't a bad one. The other character I'm not struck on is Fang, who I just kind of feel nothing about. I neither like her or dislike her. I just don't have any strong feelings about her either way. I feel like the writing isn't always really well done, but the character stories are the strongest aspect of the story as a whole, despite some ham-fisted and overly melodramatic execution at times. A flaw I find with the story is that there's not a very strong villain here. There is one, and he plays a large role in the story, but he's very generic. It doesn't help that all the secondary villains to back him up are just, nothing. There's almost nothing to them apart from one particular one, but I'm pushed to even call him a secondary villain. He barely has more than 10 minutes of screen time. It's not exactly helped when one or two of them are killed off almost unceremoniously too. It's a shame I don't have much to say about the main antagonist of this game, as I don't think this series has had a villain this boilerplate since Final Fantasy IV. I'm going to quickly discuss some spoiler sensitive stuff now. Not for too long, as I don't have too much I really want to discuss in terms of spoilers, and besides, a lot of moments I liked, especially later on, require more explanation of the context than I think they're worth. Either way, skip to the timestamp on the screen if you wish to jump ahead to the music discussion and conclusions. Alright, let's get started. Out of the gate, my favourite scene in the game, and has been since I first played it like 11 years ago now, is the one between Saz and Vanille, Sugar and Rainbows. I'll just let it play out quickly. The setup is that Saz has learned that Vanille is basically responsible for his son being made a l'Cie, and has now turned to Crystal, what appears to basically be a death sentence with their current understanding of it.
Shoot me! For your son!
Don't you even! You think you die, and that's that? You think you die and everything will be sugar and rainbows?
Neither do I. It's over. There's nothing to do. Shooting you won't help. Neither will living.
And then right after dealing with the Eidolon, which is hilarious unintentional tonal whiplash by the way.
That's right! Let's do it!
A lot of things can be excused. Shooting kids ain't one.
Kindness like his, you don't forget.
Enough is enough.
Great cliffhanger, right? He obviously doesn't kill himself, he just unlocked an extra ATB segment after all. There are several little scenes that I think at least come close to being like this, although overall I find me forgetting more of the game as time goes by during the course of writing this script. I talked about the antagonists of this game being rather lackluster. Let's discuss why in detail here. The one I was talking around is Sid Raines, who as I said seems to only have around 10 minutes of screen time in total throughout the whole game. He isn't directly a villain per se, however he seems somehow vital to the story and towards the main character understanding the way they could alter their destinies. It feels like the characters get to know him a lot more than we do as an audience, as it feels they know more about his motivations than we do. We see him briefly before attacking the Sanctum for the first time, and he talks about his ideas there, but it's really brief. And then when we next meet him, he's a boss fight, and is defying his fate as a Sanctum l'Cie, before being defeated by the party. And then a lot later, it's revealed that he's been revived by their main antagonist, Barthandelus, and being used as a puppet leader of sorts to keep order on Cocoon. And then, and I'm not even kidding here, half an hour or less of cutscenes later, he's dead again. Literally served almost nothing to the plot. I was shocked at how quickly they killed him off again. It was done in order for Barthandelus to sow chaos on Cocoon, I suppose, and spur on the cavalry into hasty action, but it just felt pointless to me in the story somehow. Also, it's not established at all how he revived Sid. Does Barthandelus have the power to revive the dead? But when Sid died, he turned into light and crystal shards. The whole subplot just leaves more questions than answers for me. Barthandelus as the main bad guy is, as I mentioned before, rather dull compared to basically everyone in the series so far. I compared it to Final Fantasy IV as Golbez was also rather generic, but I remember more of what he did and said compared to Barthandelus. Within the story of Final Fantasy XIII, he is the driving force behind everything that goes wrong for our heroes, yes, but he is incredibly dull to listen to. He gloats to the party on several occasions before engaging them in battle, and is always in control until the end. But he's just boring. I'm sorry, I wish I had more to say, but I'm honestly just drawing a blank. And that's kind of how I feel about anything else I'd want to talk about with the rest of the story, in all honesty. There's a lot to like about the story of Final Fantasy XIII. I think a lot of the themes may resonate with certain people, but I think the storytelling is really sloppy here compared to most of the series. Final Fantasy VIII also had similar issues where a lot of the storytelling was hidden in optional sources. However, I think that still was nowhere near as bad as it is here. I felt I grasped pretty much all of the story of Final Fantasy VIII without really seeking out the optional information, whereas at the end of Final Fantasy XIII, I felt like the characters understood everything way better than I did. It's not that the story is bad, the strength of the characters goes against it being straight up bad in my opinion, but for me, everything around them was not very engaging. Oh, and before I go on to talk about the music, one last thing. Do you think Fang and Fanil have Australian voice actors because they're from the land down under? Food for thought. Welcome back to anyone who skipped ahead. Let's go over the music of Final Fantasy XIII. This aspect of the game in particular is what I consider to be its strongest asset. As much as I've complained about the various things about this game, it still holds that Final Fantasy tradition of having stellar music. The soundtrack is by Masashi Hamauzu, who previously contributed to the Final Fantasy X soundtrack. He really goes for it here, creating a very diverse OST that complements the story and gameplay well. It covers a wide range of genres and some interesting instrument choices, such as having the main battle theme being a violin-led piece. It's epic when it needs to be, and quiet and subdued when that approach is more appropriate. He makes use of certain themes throughout the game and does so in a really great way. The most important being my first example, but my personal highlights for the game include The Promise, Saber's Edge, Snow's theme, Promised Eternity, The Sunlift Waterscape, Can't Catch a Break, and Blinded by Light. So, in conclusion, I'm really not a fan of Final Fantasy XIII, in case that hasn't been obvious from my extended criticisms throughout the video. There are certainly elements I like, the music, some of the character work and the battle system. A lot of the rest of it just really falls flat for me though. Like how for every character moment I liked, it could easily be followed by several ham-fisted moments too. I didn't find myself too invested in the story as a whole. I came away sort of feeling similar about the game as I did Final Fantasy VIII. I could see what people would really like about the game, but not have it resonate with me as much as them. I do have a newfound respect for the story of 8 thanks to Resident Ark's excellent podcast analysis video, secret link in the description, but I still find the gameplay super messy, which is kind of reflected in my opinion of Final Fantasy XIII, albeit flipped somewhat. I enjoyed the combat for the most part, but find the storytelling a bit sloppy, and the ending didn't impress me like it did for me in 8. So anyway, where does 13 fit into my list? I think this game is saved a lot by its soundtrack when comparing to the rest of the series, to the point where I'd at least slot it above the NES games. I don't think anything here is as iconic as what's heard in Final Fantasy IV though, but I don't hold the story of 4 in very high regards compared to the rest of the story-focused games. Despite that though, I'll still place 13 below 4. While the story of 13 definitely doesn't frustrate me in the same way that 4 did at times, I still think I'll remember more of 4's story than I will 13's, especially the villain. So the rankings as it stands are on the screen now. I'm also making a small change at the bottom of the list too. I felt I was overly harsh on Final Fantasy XI, so I'm bumping it up above 2. My reasoning being that I'm still open for playing 11 again at some point, whereas I basically never want to play Final Fantasy II ever again. So yeah, Final Fantasy XIII. Definitely found more to dislike about it this time around compared to what I remembered, but I still don't totally hate it. I still don't think it fully deserves the vitriol it gets from the fanbase, but that's fans for you I guess. Next time I'll be looking at the second and current MMO in the series, Final Fantasy XIV. I hope to see you then.